Hi there. Thanks for watching my video all the way through. My goal is to get 1,000 subscribers to my YouTube channel. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Let's move on to the stories. Story 1: The Cold Embrace. Martha Dawson had always been a cautious person. Her friends often teased her about her paranoia, but she knew better. She had seen enough in her life to understand that the world was a dangerous place, and it was better to be overly cautious than caught off guard. That's why she lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Portland, away from the noise and chaos of the city. It was her sanctuary, her fortress. But one cold November night, her world was turned upside down. It was a regular Tuesday evening. Martha sat on her couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, with a book in her hands. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but she felt safe inside her cozy home. The fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the room with warmth. Yet, despite the comfort, she couldn't shake off a strange feeling of unease that had been gnawing at her all day. She got up to check the windows and doors for the third time that night. Everything was locked, just as it should be, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave her. She decided to make herself a cup of tea, hoping it would calm her nerves. As she poured hot water into her cup, she heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. It was so quiet that she almost dismissed it as her imagination, but something made her stop. Martha set the cup down and walked towards the hallway. The house was silent, save for the wind outside. She stood there, listening, but heard nothing more. Just as she was about to turn back to the kitchen, she noticed a draft coming from the direction of the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. She moved cautiously towards the door, every instinct telling her to turn back, but she had to check. When she reached the door, she saw that the lock was undone. Martha knew for certain that she had locked it. Her hands shook as she reached out to relock the door. But before she could, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Panic gripped her. She fumbled for her phone, using its screen to cast a dim light in the darkness. As she turned on the flashlight, she saw the door slowly creaking open. She froze, unable to move. The cold wind blew into the house, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and decay. And then she heard a faint whisper, coming from just outside the door. It was so soft that she couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent shivers down her spine. Martha's breath hitched. She knew she wasn't alone. She took a step back, and that's when she saw him, a shadowy figure standing just outside the door. His face was obscured by the darkness, but she could feel his gaze locked on her. Martha wanted to scream, but fear had paralyzed her. The figure took a step forward, crossing the threshold into her home. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. The man slowly moved closer, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. Martha stumbled backward, knocking over a table as she did. The noise seemed to jolt her out of her paralysis, and she turned to run. But the man was faster. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like a vice, and pulled her towards him. No, Martha screamed, struggling against him, but his strength was overwhelming. He clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling her cries. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was his cold, empty eyes. When Martha woke up, she was in complete darkness. Her head throbbed, and she realized she was lying on a cold, hard surface. She tried to move, but her hands were bound behind her back, and her ankles were tied together. Panic surged through her as she struggled against the restraints, but it was no use. "Help," she screamed, her voice echoing in the confined space. But no one answered. She had no idea where she was or how long she had been there. The only thing she knew was that she was trapped, and there was no way out. The hours dragged on, and the cold seeped into her bones. Martha tried to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. She had no idea who had taken her or what they wanted. All she could do was wait and hope that someone would find her. But no one came. Days passed in darkness. Martha lost track of time, her mind teetering on the edge of sanity. She heard footsteps occasionally, the sound of a door opening and closing, but no one ever came to see her. Her captor was a ghost, a presence that haunted her every waking moment but remained unseen. Then, one day, she heard the door open again. But this time, the footsteps were different, lighter, quicker. Martha's heart pounded in her chest. She held her breath, praying that it was a rescuer, but deep down, she knew better. The door to her prison creaked open, and a sliver of light pierced the darkness. Martha squinted against the brightness, trying to make out the figure that stood in the doorway. It was a man, but not the one who had taken her. This one was younger, with a kind face that didn't match the horror of the situation. He crouched down beside her, his eyes full of pity. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't want it to be like this." Martha's heart sank. She knew what was coming next. The man reached out and gently stroked her hair, his touch sending a shiver of revulsion down her spine. "I have to do this," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "He told me I have to." "No, please," Martha begged, her voice hoarse from days of screaming. "You don't have to do this. Just let me go." Tears welled up in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice barely audible. And then he stood up, pulling a knife from his pocket. Martha's world collapsed around her as she realized there was no escape. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the end. But the pain never came. Instead, she felt a rush of air as the man's body was yanked backward. She opened her eyes to see her captor standing over the younger man, his face twisted in rage. The knife fell to the ground with a clatter as the two men struggled. Martha used the distraction to her advantage. She wriggled free of her bindings, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't stop to think, she just ran. She bolted out of the door, down a narrow hallway, and into the blinding daylight. The fresh air hit her like a wall, and she stumbled, nearly falling to her knees. But she kept going, fueled by pure adrenaline. She didn't know where she was or where she was going, but she knew she had to get as far away as possible. Behind her, she heard a scream, one of the men, but she didn't look back to see which one. She just ran, her feet pounding against the pavement, her breath ragged in her chest. Martha ran until she could no longer hear the sounds of struggle behind her, until she found herself on a quiet street lined with houses. She collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. She was free, but the nightmare was far from over. The memories of that cold embrace would haunt her for the rest of her life. Story 2: The Night Abduction. Emily Watson had always been a cautious person. Her friends laughed at her paranoia, but Emily knew the world was full of dangers, and she believed it was better to be overly careful than careless. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Los Angeles, away from the noise and bustle of the city. The house was her sanctuary, her fortress. But one night, her world was turned upside down. It was an ordinary Friday evening. Emily sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, with a glass of wine in her hand. She was watching a series and enjoying the quiet. However, something was off. At some point, she felt a strange unease, as if someone was watching her. She looked around, but there was no one else in the room. The ghost of fear began to rise within her. She got up and checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. Everything was in place, but the feeling of unease lingered. Emily decided to take a bath to calm down. Warm water always helped her relax and forget her worries. She filled the tub, added her favorite lavender-scented bubble bath, and immersed herself in the water, trying to rid herself of the nagging anxiety. Suddenly, the bathroom light flickered. Emily jumped. She told herself it was just a burnt-out bulb, but the tension didn't leave her. When the light went out completely, she froze. In the complete darkness, she was gripped by real terror. She tried to reach for the towel, but instead, her hand touched something cold and hard. It was her phone, which she had left on the edge of the tub. But how could it have ended up there? Emily picked up the phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the room, and she saw that the bathroom door, which she had closed, was now slightly ajar. Her breathing quickened. Someone was in the house. Gathering all her courage, she got up and, wrapping herself in a towel, stepped into the hallway. It was quiet, but she felt someone's presence. On the phone screen, she noticed a new message. With trembling hands, she opened it. The message was from an unknown number. "I see you." Emily dropped the phone in fear. She turned around and saw a shadow move in the hallway. She barely managed to hold back a scream. Without thinking, she ran to the front door, hoping to escape, but her heart sank when she saw that the door was wide open. She turned back and saw a man standing in the doorway to the living room. He was tall, with a hood pulled low over his face, and he held a knife in his hand. Emily's blood ran cold. She tried to back away, but the man moved closer. "Who are you? What do you want?" Emily's voice trembled, but she tried to stay calm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. Emily screamed and tried to break free, but he was much stronger. He covered her mouth with his hand, muffling her cries, and dragged her out of the house. Outside, it was pitch dark. The man pushed her into a van parked near the house. Inside, there were no windows, only a dim light from a small bulb hanging from the ceiling. He threw her onto the floor and closed the door, locking it. Emily was alone in the darkness. She could hear her own heartbeat and the sound of the van's engine as it started. She had no idea where they were going or what awaited her. All she knew was that she was trapped with no way to escape. Hours seemed to pass as they drove through the night. Emily's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. She couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever terrible fate lay ahead. She needed to find a way out. The van suddenly stopped. Emily heard the driver's door open and close. The man was coming for her. She quickly scanned the small space for anything she could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. The door to the back of the van opened, and the man appeared, his face hidden in shadow. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her out. They were in a remote area, surrounded by dense forest. There was no sign of civilization, no lights, no roads, just trees and darkness. The man dragged her towards a small cabin that was barely visible in the gloom. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, and the man forced her to sit down. He tied her hands behind the chair, ensuring she couldn't move. Emily struggled, but it was useless. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man finally spoke, his voice cold and emotionless. "It's not about why, it's about when." "When? What do you mean?" Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied, turning away from her. He left the cabin, leaving her alone in the dark. Emily's thoughts raced. Who was he? What did he want with her? And what did he mean by when? She knew she had to escape, but with her hands tied and no clear way out, she felt hopeless. Time passed slowly. Emily's fear turned to anger. She refused to be a victim. She began working at the ropes, binding her hands, trying to loosen them. Her wrists were raw and bloody, but she didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to free one hand. She quickly untied herself and stood up, her legs shaky from sitting so long. She had to be quiet, he could return at any moment. Emily looked around the cabin for something she could use as a weapon. She found an old rusty knife in a drawer and held it tightly, ready to defend herself. She approached the door and listened. There was no sound outside. She slowly opened the door and stepped out into the night. The forest was silent, the air cold. She had no idea where she was or which direction to go, but she couldn't stay there. She started walking, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw the man coming towards her. He had noticed she was gone. Emily didn't hesitate. She ran as fast as she could, the branches and leaves slashing at her skin. The man was close behind, his footsteps growing louder. Emily knew she couldn't outrun him forever. She had to find a place to hide or something to defend herself with. But in the darkness, everything looked the same. She saw a small cave up ahead, partially hidden by bushes. Without thinking, she ducked inside, holding her breath as she listened for the man. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. Emily waited, every muscle in her body tense. Then, she heard him move away, his footsteps fading into the distance. She let out a sigh of relief but knew she wasn't safe yet. She had to keep moving. Hours passed as she made her way through the forest, unsure if she was going in the right direction. Her body was exhausted, her mind numb from fear. But she couldn't give up. She had to survive. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, she stumbled upon a road. In the distance, she saw headlights approaching. She waved her arms frantically, hoping the driver would stop. The car slowed down, and a kind-looking woman rolled down the window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" she asked, concern in her voice. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please help me," she whispered. The woman helped her into the car and drove her to the nearest police station. Emily was safe, but the terror of that night would stay with her forever. She had escaped, but she knew that somewhere out there, her captor was still out there, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Story 3: The Last Bus. Megan Wilson never liked coming home late at night, but work had run long that evening. She was a graphic designer at a small advertising agency in downtown New York. The job demanded a lot of time and nerves, but Megan loved it. The only thing that marred her life was the late-night bus rides home. At night, the city seemed completely different: empty streets, rare passers-by, dim streetlights. Megan felt vulnerable, but she had no other way to get home. When she left the office, it was nearly midnight. Megan quickened her pace, heading for the bus stop. The weather was bleak as well. A cold wind blew, sneaking under her coat, and a light drizzle fell from the gray sky. She reached the bus stop and checked the schedule. The last bus was just a few minutes away. She stood under the shelter, arms crossed to keep warm, and watched the empty street. Usually at this time there were other people waiting at the stop, but tonight she was alone. It unsettled her a bit, but she tried not to think about it too much. A few minutes later, the bus appeared around the corner. Its headlights lit up the road, and Megan felt a slight sense of relief. She got on the bus and noticed that it was almost empty, save for a few passengers. She chose a seat by the window, far from the others, and pulled out her phone to pass the time during the ride. The bus started moving, and Megan noticed that the driver, a middle-aged man with a sullen face, looked at her in the rearview mirror longer than was normal. Her heart tightened, but she forced herself to ignore it. Just your imagination, she thought, focusing on her phone. After a while, she noticed something strange. The bus was moving too slowly, making unusually long stops on the deserted streets. Megan looked out the window, but all she saw were dark buildings and empty sidewalks. One by one, the passengers got off at their stops, and soon Megan was the only one left in the bus. The silence and emptiness started to weigh on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At one point, Megan looked up and noticed that the bus had turned onto a street she didn't recognize. It was a narrow alley, lit by only a few streetlights. "Excuse me, this isn't my route," she said hesitantly, addressing the driver. He didn't respond. It was as if he hadn't heard her. The bus kept moving, deeper into the maze of narrow, abandoned streets. Megan felt the panic rising in her chest. "Hey, do you hear me?" she shouted louder, stepping closer to the driver's cabin. This time, the man slowly turned his head toward her, and in his eyes, Megan saw something that made her blood run cold. It was the look of someone who had something sinister in mind. His face remained impassive, but a faint, sinister smile played at the corners of his lips. "Get out," he said shortly. "What?" "No, I'm not getting out. You're supposed to take me home," Megan was nearly shouting, gripped by fear. The driver stopped the bus in the middle of a deserted street, turned to her, and repeated, "Get out of the bus." Megan froze, realizing that refusing could be dangerous, but getting out could be even worse. She decided to try and run, but as soon as she took a step back, the man abruptly rose from his seat and lunged at her. She ran to the back door, but her hands were shaking, and she couldn't find the button to open it right away. The driver was already close. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward him. Megan screamed, trying to break free, but his grip was like iron. She tried to hit him with her free hand, but he just laughed. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a wave of horror washed over her. She felt helpless. But just when she thought she was done for, she saw the emergency exit lever. Gathering all her strength, she managed to yank the lever, and the back door of the bus flew open. Megan didn't hesitate. She jumped out of the bus and ran down the street. Behind her, she heard the man's angry shouts, but she didn't stop. The cold night air cut her lungs, but she ran, not looking back. She ran until she saw a small diner still open. Without thinking, she burst inside and shouted for help. The few people in the diner turned to look at her, shocked. Megan could barely speak, gasping for breath and pointing back toward the street. Someone immediately called the police. The officers arrived quickly, but the bus was already gone. They took Megan to the station, where she gave her statement. She described the driver, the bus, and the route, but when the officers checked, they found that no buses were supposed to be running at that time. And none of the city's bus drivers matched the description she gave. Megan was eventually taken home, but the experience left her shaken. She tried to put it behind her, but the memory of that night haunted her. She never took the bus again, especially at night. But deep down, she knew that the man who had tried to take her wasn't just an ordinary bus driver. He was something far more sinister, something that lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the city, that bus was still running, searching for someone else to abduct.